Hi, everyone. Very glad to be able to present here today. So the title of the paper that I'm presenting is Mechanism Design with a Common Dataset. The title of the talk is Treatment Approval, Why the Discrepancy? Well, this is basically an example or application of the paper, which is a more general framework for thinking about mechanism design, where both the designer and the agents are learning. This example, which is about approval of medical treatments or drugs, I think is going to be especially interesting in highlighting some aspects of the framework and in showing how sort of data-driven mechanism design, a theory of data-driven mechanism design, can not just help us come up with better designs for the world, but actually help us understand designs and institutions that already exist. OK, so first let's talk about the problem of treatment choice. Treatment choice is basically the question of a doctor who uses clinical data, so data from clinical trials, to assign treatments to patients. Now, this is a statistical problem, and you might have heard of it under different names. Treatment choice is common in econometrics, but it's classification or statistical learning or statistical decision making. Now, this is a fairly well understood problem. What I want to do is focus on a sort of a higher level problem, which is that of a regulator. A regulator like the Food and Drug Administration here in the US that uses clinical trial data to restrict the treatments that doctors can assign. Now, this is a delegation problem, but we'll see that it raises new statistical challenges. OK, so let's start out by looking at how treatment approval is currently done in the United States. And by law, the Food and Drug Administration is required to approve drugs if they meet a substantial, or only if they meet a substantial evidence of effectiveness standard. Right? So you can only approve a drug if you are very confident that it is effective. Now, what does this mean in practice? Well, let's look at some draft guidance from the Food and Drug Administration clarifying this standard, which says that the strength of evidence in each clinical trial contributing to meeting the substantial evidence standard should be assessed by appropriate statistical methods. The uncertainty about the findings from each trial should be sufficiently small, and the findings should be unlikely to result from chance alone, as demonstrated by a statistically significant result or a high posterior probability of effectiveness. Statistical approaches should be specified in advance to limit erroneous conclusions stemming from multiplicity. So the two things I wanted you to take away from this, highlighted in blue, are one, that substantial evidence of effectiveness means high statistical confidence. And the second thing is that we have a concern for multiplicity, so the multiple testing problem. Both of these features will come up later in this talk. Now, this is what's done in practice. Okay? But it's actually kind of difficult to justify this practice from a theoretical perspective, either using the literature on treatment choice or related literatures on statistical learning, or from the perspective of delegation, as we'll see later on. And hypothesis testing as a way to make decisions has been heavily criticized, and many of you will be familiar with those criticisms. OK, so what's the framework that I'm going to be using? Well, of course, I'm going to be thinking about a regulator that is approving treatments that a doctor can prescribe. The regulator and the doctor are going to be similar in some ways and different in others. So both the regulator and the doctor are going to observe the clinical trial data. Okay, so the clinical trial is going to tell you something about, in a statistical sense, about the effectiveness or benefits that a patient gets from the treatment. So the regulator can learn from the clinical trial data, but the doctor can also learn, whether that's directly by looking at the reports or indirectly by consulting medical textbooks that are informed by those results. The discrepancy in information is going to come from the costs, right? So cost is sort of like a catch-all term that I'm using to reflect information that the doctor might have about the compatibility of a particular treatment with a particular patient that the regulator might not know. So this could be things like the price of the drug for the patient. This could be things like inconvenience. It could be things like side effects that maybe the clinical trial didn't measure, and so forth. And finally, I'm going to assume that both the regulator and the doctor care about the patient welfare. So in this simple example, there's actually no conflict of interest. They both want the same thing. So my goal here is to design a statistical decision rule for the regulator under reasonable assumptions about the doctor's behavior. And I'll tell you what those reasonable assumptions are later in this talk. And that's sort of one of the key contributions, I think, of this work. OK, so the main result, I'm going to show that the optimal approval rule resembles stepwise multiple hypothesis testing, where the treatment is approved if and only if the sample average treatment effect exceeds some critical value. Moreover, that critical value is, of course, decreasing in the sample size, but increasing as more treatments are approved. So this resembles sort of the stepwise methods for correcting for multiple testing bias. Why, at a high level, and we'll see this a little bit more later, delegating too many approving too many treatments is going to make the learning problem of the doctor more complex, right? Essentially, if you approve 100 drugs, then you need to evaluate 100 different hypotheses. And this kind of complexity is going to lead to worse guarantees for the policy. In the paper, I extend this framework and the results to the more abstract question of mechanism design with a common data set, where we have a designer and a single agent learning from data, right? So we're trying to replace the common prior assumption or common knowledge of a distribution with learning from data. And what we see, as an intuition in several examples, including this one, is that this framework can provide a micro-foundation for relatively simple policies. OK, so let me dive into the model. So the model of treatment is relatively straightforward. So we have a non-strategic patient afflicted by a disease. M treatments available in total. I'm going to denote each treatment by J. Patient outcome is going to be random. It's going to be given by the random variable yj, drawn from some distribution fj. And there'll be some benefit to the treatment, which is just my term for the average treatment effect. So this is going to be the expected outcome. There's some cost to the treatment, Cj, which is just bounded above by C bar. And I'm going to assume that treatment 1 is a placebo, where the benefits and costs are normalized to 0. The patient's welfare from the treatment is just the benefit minus the cost. OK, treatment approval. So of course, we're going to start with the data set. And the data set is clinical trial data, which includes n observations of the patient outcomes for each treatment J. And these are IAD observations. Now, the regulator strategy is going to map the data to a subset of approved treatments given by AN, n again being the sample size. And the doctor's strategy is going to map the data, the costs, and the approved set to some treatment Jn. Notice that both AN and Jn have the subscript n, indicating that they are random variables. Why are they random? They depend on the sample through the strategy. All right, so that's treatment approval. Now, finally, I just need 2 more slides to specify the doctor's utility function and the regulator's utility function. Apologies, there's going to be a little bit of notation, but then we're going to get into the behavioral assumptions, which I think are especially interesting. So the doctor, as I mentioned, cares about patient welfare. What this formula is basically saying is the doctor's utility big U, this is the ex ante utility, is going to be the expected patient welfare according to the treatment given by the doctor, Jn, minus some penalty for choosing an unapproved treatment. And the penalty is infinity, so you will never choose a treatment that's not approved. OK, and that's big U sub d. So that term will come up again. I'll also later on use the notation of UD conditional on A. That means the expected utility conditional on the set of approved drugs being equal to A. Again, AN is a random variable, depends on the sample. So conditioning on A tells you something about the sample. OK, regulator's utility. So the regulator also cares about the patient welfare. But the main challenge here is that the regulator has uncertainty about the costs. We assume that the regulator does not know the costs. And so we need some way of dealing with that uncertainty. What I'm going to do is assume that the regulator cares about or evaluates a strategy by the worst case regret over the costs. So there are many different ways that you could think about evaluating uncertainty. You could put a prior over the costs. I'm going to be using worst case regret because that's more consistent with the statistical literature. But you could imagine doing something else, and I imagine the results will be similar. So in other words, the regulator's utility, big U sub r, is just going to be the worst case difference between the welfare under the optimal approvals, if you knew the costs, minus the welfare under the actual approvals. OK, so now let's talk about the doctor's behavior. So in order to introduce a different framework for thinking about the doctor's behavior, I first need to convince you that the existing frameworks are not effective. So I'm going to show you how 2 existing frameworks are not effective in modeling this particular situation. The first proposition is going to show that under 2, again, standard modeling assumptions. One is that the doctor knows the true distribution. And the other is that the regulator and the doctor share a common prior belief. You end up getting an extreme recommendation. The extreme recommendation is to ignore the data and approve all the treatments. And the intuition in this very simple model is also relatively simple. It's that the doctor cares about patient welfare, so there's no conflict of interest. And the doctor has access to the clinical trial, and the doctor knows the cost. So the doctor has the same information, the same utility function, so you might as well delegate everything. OK. Now, of course, the idea that the doctor knows the true distribution or that the regulator and the doctor share the same beliefs in a setting with a lot of uncertainty, like medicine, seems like a very strong assumption. Particularly if the doctor knew the true distribution, why run a clinical trial? Which is basically what this is saying. OK, so we might take a different approach, which is to say, let's get rid of all these assumptions, and let's think about the doctor's beliefs as totally unknown, in which case either the regulator minimizes the worst case utility over the doctor's beliefs, or the regulator minimizes the worst case regret over the doctor's beliefs. In either of these two cases, the optimal policy will ignore the data and only approve the placebo. Right? And so here, we take a very robust approach, but it's so robust, we get a very conservative result that doesn't really look like what we see in practice. The question is, can we do something in the middle by taking advantage of the clinical trial data? OK. So what I'm going to do, the assumption I'm going to make on the doctor is based on two different ideas. The first idea is that since the doctor has access to this data, we should expect the doctor to use the data in a way that prevents them from making unreasonably severe or frequent mistakes. So that's going to be captured by what I call lower bound. So the doctor's strategy is going to satisfy a lower bound, LB, if ex ante, the doctor's utility, given the regulator's strategy and the distribution, exceeds that lower bound. So we're just saying that you're not doing too badly given the regulator's strategy and given the true distribution. Of course, we can define the lower bound to just be equal to the optimal payoff if you knew the true distribution, and then we would get the sort of standard Bayesian model. But if the lower bound is anything less than that, then we generalize the standard Bayesian model. The second part has to do with calibrating this lower bound. And the principle that I want is that even doctors with no prior knowledge about the distribution should be able to satisfy this bound. More precisely, this notion of statistical attractability is going to say that given the regulator strategy, the lower bound is tractable if there exists a doctor strategy as star D such that that strategy will satisfy the lower bound, will respect the lower bound, regardless of the distribution. So what do I mean by this? I mean, there has to exist some, let's say, off-the-shelf algorithm that does not require any kind of knowledge about the distribution, such that the doctor can use this algorithm to satisfy the lower bound. And in that sense, this lower bound does not require any prior knowledge, and in that sense, it's prior-free. OK. So having defined the behavioral assumption, or almost defined it, let me talk about the regulator strategy. So I want to talk about optimal treatment approval under a tractable lower bound. For the presentation, I'm going to make a very strong simplifying assumption that I relax in the paper, which is that the regulator knows the true distribution. So I'm going to really just focus in on the doctor's learning problem. Now, the reason why I do that is because once you think about the regulator and learning at the same time, there are a bunch of additional challenges that arise, which are basically the substance and meat of the actual paper. I'm going to be using a lower bound that comes from Massart's finite lemma in statistical learning, which just says that the doctor will, the lower bound is basically the optimal payoff you could get if you knew the true distribution, minus some error, some buffer, where that buffer is going to be decreasing in square root n, and it's going to be increasing in the number of treatments approved. Basically, this captures the fact that the more treatments you approve, the more hypotheses you need to evaluate, the more complex the learning problem is. And so proposition 3 is going to say that the optimal regulator strategy under this Massart lower bound will look like stepwise multiple hypothesis testing. In other words, you will approve the kth best treatment if and only if the benefit of that treatment exceeds a critical value, where that critical value is increasing in k, so increasing in the number of treatments already approved, and it's going to be decreasing in square root n. Right? So it's not motivated in the same way as a hypothesis test, but for very different reasons, you end up getting something that looks like a hypothesis test. OK, and moreover, we need to verify that the Massart lower bound is tractable for this strategy. Now, if the regulator were learning about the distribution f from the data rather than just knowing in advance, that Massart lower bound would not necessarily be tractable, and that's one of the main reasons why the paper has additional results. OK, so how much time do I have? 1 minute. OK, 1 minute. So I'm going to skip this. I actually thought I already removed this slide. It's OK. I thought I already removed that slide, so I'm surprised to still see it here. I realized I would be a bit over time. OK, so conclusion. We introduced this model of treatment approval, which I think is an important, relevant real-world problem, and derive the Food and Drug Administration's substantial evidence standard from first principles. and we justified a form of stepwise multiple hypothesis testing. One way to think about this is we moved from statistical decision theory or treatment choice to statistical mechanism design or treatment approval, right, by taking into account the strategic actors within this learning problem. And we see that by making that shift, we can reach strikingly different conclusions. And of course, we require new behavioral assumptions based on this idea of statistical tractability. It also highlights, I think, new statistical issues that, again, I didn't discuss in this talk, but are heavily discussed in the paper. We can also think about this as moving from mechanism design to statistical mechanism design. And we see that statistical mechanism design can offer principled ways to relax common knowledge assumptions and endogenize, in a sense, simple policies. Thank you very much.
We have time for question. Please walk to the microphone if you allow me.
Can you say a bit more on why you call it tractable? So just from how you presented on the slide,
Yep.
it was not, that name was not clear for me.
Right. So tractability is basically getting at the idea that we impose some performance bound. We impose some lower bound on performance. And it should be possible to achieve that bound without any prior knowledge. So regardless of the data generating process, you should be able to achieve that bound. In that sense, it's tractable to achieve it.
Okay, so it's separate assumptions. The existence of a lower bound, which you additionally qualify as needing to be tractable.
Yes, so basically the structure of the behavioral assumptions that I'm considering are these lower bounds, but just saying there's a lower bound doesn't say much because it could be any lower bound. And then tractability is a property of that lower bound. Yeah.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. Would anything fundamentally change if you had heterogeneous treatment effects of the different drugs on different subpopulations?
Can you repeat the question?
Would anything change if you had heterogeneous treatment effects for different drugs on different patients? So I guess there is some heterogeneity in the sense that the treatment effect for a particular patient is random variable. You could imagine including other covariate information such that patients with different covariates will have different treatment effects. You could think about that covariate information as like the doctor's private information, and maybe it reflects itself in a sense in the costs. You could also think of those covariates as something that is observed in clinical trial, in which case you can imagine all this analysis just conditioned on the covariates. Of course, if you condition on too many covariates, you end up with like a small sample size issue, which would, I think, just tend to push you towards even simpler policies and even fewer drugs approved. But it's a good question.
All right, thank the speaker again.